Sometimes the moment that destroys a marriage lasts less than 3 seconds. Ethan Walker never imagined his would end under the cold fluorescent lights of St. Matthew Medical Center on a rainy Thursday night in Seattle. The windshield wipers swept across the glass in a steady rhythm as he pulled into the visitor parking lot just after 8:30 p.m. The bouquet of white lilies resting on the passenger seat had already begun to droop from the damp air. Claire loved lilies. At least, she used to. Lately, it felt like he didn't know what she loved anymore. For nearly 3 years, something had been fading between them. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just little pieces disappearing one by one. Fewer smiles over breakfast. Fewer late-night conversations. Fewer moments when her hand instinctively reached for his. Claire had become distant, quiet, almost unreachable. Friends noticed. Family noticed. Even strangers seemed to notice. Yet whenever Ethan asked if something was wrong, she always gave him the same answer. I'm just tired. Tonight was supposed to be different. She had texted him that morning asking if they could have dinner together after her appointment. The message was simple, but it felt like a crack of sunlight breaking through months of gray clouds. So Ethan left work early. He bought her favorite flowers. He even made a reservation at the little Italian restaurant where they had celebrated their first anniversary. As he stepped into the hospital lobby, rainwater dripped from the shoulders of his coat. The building smelled faintly of coffee, antiseptic, and polished floors. The receptionist smiled politely as he passed. Claire's text had said she would be on the 4th floor. He pressed the elevator button and waited. The bouquet hung loosely in his hand. For the first time in months, he felt hopeful. The elevator doors opened. The hallway beyond was unusually quiet. Most of the lights had been dimmed. Ethan walked slowly, checking room numbers as he moved past closed doors and empty waiting areas. Then he saw her. Through a large glass window at the far end of the corridor. Claire. Her blonde hair fell softly across her shoulders. She stood facing a man Ethan had never seen before. Tall. Dark jacket. Early 40s maybe. They were close enough to be speaking quietly, though Ethan couldn't hear a word. He stopped walking. Something about the scene felt strangely intimate. Claire lowered her eyes. The man gently touched her shoulder. Ethan's grip tightened around the bouquet. Then, before his mind could process what he was seeing, Claire stepped forward and kissed him. Everything inside Ethan went silent. The hallway. The rain. The distant hum of hospital machinery. Gone. The lilies slipped from his fingers and landed softly on the polished floor. Neither of them noticed. Neither of them looked his way. For a long moment, Ethan simply stood there, staring through the glass as if the world on the other side belonged to someone else. Then he bent down, picked up the crushed bouquet, turned around, and walked back toward the elevator. He never knocked on the door. He never called her name. And as the elevator doors slowly closed in front of him, one question echoed through the emptiness he suddenly felt inside. Who was the man Claire had chosen over him? The rain had stopped by the time Ethan reached home, but the silence inside the house felt heavier than the storm he had driven through. He unlocked the front door and stepped into the darkness without turning on a single light. The bouquet of lilies remained in his hand. Their white petals were bent and bruised now, water droplets still clinging to the edges. For several seconds, he simply stood in the entryway, staring at nothing. The house smelled exactly the same as it always had. Claire's lavender candle sat on the bookshelf. A pair of her shoes rested beside the staircase. A coffee mug she had forgotten that morning remained beside the sink. Every ordinary detail felt strangely untouched, as though the world had not yet realized his marriage had just ended. Ethan walked into the kitchen and laid the flowers on the counter. One petal drifted loose and landed beside the mug. He watched it fall. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down. The digital clock above the stove glowed 9:47 p.m. He did not call Claire. He did not send a text. He did not ask for an explanation. Part of him wondered if he should. Another part already knew he would not. Because deep down, this moment did not feel like a surprise. It felt like an answer. For years he had been searching for a reason behind the distance growing between them. Tonight, He believed he had finally found it. His mind replayed every small detail from the past 3 years. The canceled date nights. The conversations cut short. The way Claire often stared out windows as though she was somewhere else entirely. The nights she claimed exhaustion and fell asleep before he could finish speaking. He remembered birthdays that felt rushed. Anniversaries that felt polite. Holidays that felt rehearsed. Piece by piece, his memories rearranged themselves into a picture he could no longer ignore. Around midnight, Ethan opened the desk drawer in his home office. Inside sat a leather folder containing documents from a legal consultation he had scheduled nearly 8 months earlier. At the time, he never followed through. He had convinced himself things could improve. That love deserved patience. That marriage required endurance. Tonight he opened the folder again. The papers were still there, untouched. He stared at them for a long time. Then he signed his name. The scratch of the pen sounded unusually loud in the empty room. By 1 o'clock in the morning, he had finished everything. No dramatic speeches. No accusations. No evidence. No confrontation. Just signatures. Quiet and final. He placed the completed documents back into the folder and left them neatly on the dining room table. Beside them, he set a single note written on plain white paper. The message contained only 6 words. I hope he makes you happy. When the ink dried, Ethan folded his wedding ring into the corner of the note. The gold band reflected the soft light above the table before settling into stillness. Upstairs, the bedroom remained exactly as Claire had left it that morning. Her favorite sweater hung over a chair. A novel rested face down on her nightstand. Ethan stood in the doorway for several moments before turning away. He slept in the guest room that night. Not because he was angry. Not because he hated her. But because for the first time in 11 years, the room no longer felt like theirs. As dawn slowly brightened the windows, Ethan stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Somewhere across the city, Claire was still unaware that a decision had already been made. And when she finally walked through the front door later that day, she would discover something even stranger than divorce papers waiting on the table. She would discover that Ethan had not fought for answers at all. Claire arrived home shortly after noon carrying a paper cup of coffee that had already gone cold. The sky outside remained overcast, casting a soft gray light through the neighborhood. She parked in the driveway and sat in her car longer than usual, her hands resting quietly on the steering wheel. The hospital visit had taken more out of her than she expected. Not physically. Emotionally. For several minutes, she stared at the front door of the house she had shared with Ethan for 11 years. Then she finally stepped out. The familiar creak of the porch greeted her as she walked toward the entrance. Everything appeared normal. Too normal. When she opened the door, the silence inside immediately felt different. Not empty. Deliberate. The kind of silence that seemed to be waiting for something. Claire set her purse down and called Ethan's name. No answer. She tried again. Nothing. Her eyes moved through the living room, the kitchen, the hallway. Then she noticed the folder on the dining table. Her footsteps slowed. Beside it sat a single sheet of paper. And resting on top of the note was Ethan's wedding ring. Claire stopped breathing for a moment. The coffee cup slipped from her fingers and rolled across the hardwood floor. She barely noticed. Slowly, she approached the table. Her hands trembled as she picked up the note. 6 words. That was all. I hope he makes you happy. The color drained from her face. She looked at the ring again. The gold band caught the afternoon light exactly the way it had on their wedding day. 11 years reduced to a circle of metal and a sentence. Claire lowered herself into a chair and opened the folder. Page after page confirmed what she already knew before. Reading the details. Divorce papers. Signed. Completed. Ready to be filed. She stared at Ethan's signature for a long time. The handwriting looked steady. Certain. There was no sign of anger. No desperate message hidden between the lines. Somehow that hurt more than shouting ever could. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. Then something unexpected happened. She did not reach for her phone. She did not call Ethan. She did not rush to explain. Instead, she quietly closed the folder and placed both hands over it, as though she had been expecting this day for a very long time. The grandfather clock in the living room ticked steadily through the silence. 1 minute, then another. Claire sat perfectly still, her gaze drifting toward the staircase, toward the photographs lining the wall. Family vacations, Christmas mornings, weekend trips to the Oregon coast. Moments frozen in frames. Moments that suddenly felt impossibly distant. Eventually she stood and walked upstairs. The bedroom remained untouched. Ethan had not packed anything. His clothes still hung neatly in the closet. His watch remained on the dresser. Yet somehow his absence filled every corner of the room. Claire opened the nightstand beside her bed and pulled out a small silver key attached to a faded blue ribbon. For several seconds she stared at it. Then she crossed the room and knelt beside the back corner of the closet. Hidden behind a row of storage bins sat a wooden box. Simple, worn, locked. Her fingers brushed across the lid, the same way they had hundreds of times before. But she did not open it. She never did. Instead, she held the key tightly in her palm and closed her eyes. A single tear slipped down her cheek. Because inside that box was the truth. The truth Ethan had spent years searching for. The truth she had spent years protecting him from. And now, with divorce papers sitting downstairs, that secret suddenly felt heavier than ever before. The wooden box remained unopened. Claire sat on the closet floor with the silver key resting in her hand while afternoon sunlight slowly shifted across the carpet. She had imagined this moment countless times over the years. Sometimes Ethan discovered the truth by accident. Sometimes she found the courage to tell him herself. But in every version she had ever imagined, there had always been a conversation, an explanation, a chance for him to understand. She never imagined he would leave first. Downstairs, the house remained silent except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator. Claire carefully placed the key back around her wrist using the faded blue ribbon and slid the box deeper into the shadows. Then she stood and walked toward the bathroom mirror. The woman staring back at her looked older than 40. Not because of wrinkles or gray hair. Because of exhaustion. The kind that settled deep beneath the skin and refused to leave. She splashed cold water across her face and forced herself to breathe slowly. For a moment, her eyes drifted toward the small orange prescription bottle sitting beside the sink. She looked away almost immediately. 3 years earlier, everything had been different. Ethan used to joke that she was the warmest person in any room. The woman who remembered birthdays. The woman who left handwritten notes inside lunch bags. The woman who danced barefoot in the kitchen whenever her favorite songs came on the radio. She remembered Sunday mornings filled with pancakes and laughter. Road trips along the Pacific Coast Highway. Summer evenings spent on their back porch, watching the sky turn pink above the trees. Back then, Ethan knew every version of her smile. Then one ordinary Tuesday changed everything. The memory returned with painful clarity. A doctor's office. A white examination room. The faint scent of disinfectant. A stack of medical papers resting on a desk. Claire sitting alone while a specialist explained things she could barely process. Words that did not sound real at first. Follow-up testing. Long-term treatment. Uncertainty. Risks. Questions without answers. She remembered driving home afterward with both hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her fingers ached. When she walked through the front door that evening, Ethan was making dinner. He smiled when he saw her. Asked how her day had been. She smiled back and lied. It became the first lie. Then came another. And another. Over time, secrets began replacing conversations. Distance replaced comfort. Silence replaced honesty. She convinced herself she was protecting him. Convinced herself that carrying the burden alone was somehow an act of love. Yet every year that passed created a greater space between them. Until eventually she became a stranger inside her own marriage. Her phone suddenly vibrated on the bathroom counter. Claire looked down. A message. Daniel Brooks. She hesitated before opening it. Only a few words appeared on the screen. Did you tell him? Claire stared at the question. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard. Then she typed a short response. No. A few seconds later another message appeared. You cannot keep doing this forever. Claire closed her eyes. Daniel had been saying the same thing for years. And every year she ignored him. She slipped the phone into her pocket and walked back downstairs. The divorce papers still sat on the dining table exactly where she had left them. The afternoon light illuminated Ethan's signature across the final page. For a long moment she traced the edge of the paper with her fingertips. Then her gaze settled on the wedding ring beside the note. The sight of it sent a quiet ache through her chest. Because Ethan believed he had finally discovered her secret. The heartbreaking truth was that he had discovered the wrong one. The following morning arrived with a thin layer of fog hanging over the city. Claire barely slept. The divorce papers remained untouched on the dining room table, exactly where Ethan had left them. She had spent most of the night sitting in the dark living room, listening to the steady ticking of the clock and wondering whether silence had finally cost her everything. Shortly after 8 o'clock, her phone rang. She already knew who it was before looking at the screen. Daniel Brooks. She answered after the second ring. You missed your appointment, he said gently. Claire glanced toward the window. I know. A pause followed. You cannot keep avoiding this. She closed her eyes. Ethan left. The line fell quiet. Daniel seemed to understand immediately. He had been one of the few people who knew the full story. One of the few people who had watched her slowly build walls around herself year after year. Do you want me to come by? He finally asked. Claire almost said no. Instead, she whispered yes. An hour later, Daniel stood in her kitchen holding 2 cups of coffee. In another life, someone seeing them together might have mistaken the scene for something intimate. But the truth was far less dramatic. Their friendship had been built inside waiting rooms, examination offices, and difficult conversations neither of them ever wanted to have. Daniel was not a secret romance. He was the person who had spent years trying to convince Claire to stop carrying impossible burdens alone. He set the coffee down and looked toward the dining table. His eyes immediately found the folder. So it happened, he said quietly. Claire nodded. Neither of them touched the papers. For several moments they simply stood there. Then Daniel walked toward the living room bookshelf. He reached for a framed photograph from years ago. Ethan and Claire standing on a beach in Oregon. Wind in their hair. Smiles so natural they seemed effortless. Daniel studied the image. He loves you, he said. Claire laughed softly, though there was no joy in it. Not anymore. Daniel returned the frame to its place. You would be surprised how much love can survive when people are given the truth. Claire lowered her eyes. The word truth felt heavier every time she heard it. Her gaze drifted toward the hallway. Toward the closet upstairs. Toward the locked wooden box. Daniel followed her line of sight. You still have not opened it? Claire shook her head. No. 3 years, Claire. I know. Daniel exhaled slowly. There was frustration in his expression, but also compassion. Because he understood what that box represented. Not just secrets. Fear. Regret. Hope. All carefully sealed away. The same way Claire had sealed away pieces of herself. Around noon, Daniel prepared to leave. As he stepped toward the front door, Claire suddenly spoke. The hospital. He turned back. What about it? She swallowed hard. Do you think he saw us? Daniel's expression changed instantly. For the first time, genuine concern crossed his face. Neither of them mentioned the moment directly. The hallway. The glass window. The brief gesture Ethan had witnessed. Yet both knew exactly what she meant. Daniel remained silent for several seconds. Then he nodded once. I think he did. Claire looked down at the floor. The answer hurt even though she already knew it. Daniel hesitated before speaking again. If Ethan saw that and walked away, then he believed something that is not true. Claire felt tears gathering once more. The worst part is that I cannot even blame him. After Daniel left, the house grew quiet again. Claire stood alone beside the dining table. Her eyes settled on the wedding ring Ethan had left behind. Then they moved to the staircase. Finally, toward the closet upstairs. For 3 years she had been protecting a secret she believed would save Ethan from pain. But now another question had emerged. What if keeping that secret had been the very thing that destroyed them both? That evening, for the first time in 3 years, Claire unlocked the wooden box. The key trembled slightly in her fingers as the small lock clicked open. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows, turning the world beyond the glass into a blur of gray lights and shadows. For several seconds, she simply stared at the lid. Then she lifted it. Inside were dozens of envelopes arranged with impossible care. Some were sealed. Some were worn from being handled too many times. Every one of them had the same name written across the front. Ethan. Claire closed her eyes. The oldest letter sat on top. The date written in the corner immediately transported her back 3 years. Back to the week everything changed. Slowly, she unfolded the paper. The handwriting was unmistakably hers. Ethan, if you are reading this, then I finally found the courage to tell you the truth. She stopped there. Her vision blurred. She already knew every word that followed because she had written them all. Yet, she had never given him a single one. Not one. Beneath the first letter rested dozens more. Letters written after appointments. After test results. After sleepless nights. After moments when fear became too heavy to carry alone. Each one represented a conversation she wanted to have but never did. A truth she almost shared but buried instead. Claire spent hours sitting on the closet floor, surrounded by pieces of a life Ethan never knew existed. At some point her phone rang again. Daniel. She answered quietly. I opened it. Silence followed. Then Daniel asked all of it. Claire looked at the stack of letters. Not yet. Maybe it is time. She understood what he meant. Daniel was not talking about the box. He was talking about Ethan. About honesty. About 3 years spent hiding behind silence. Claire swallowed hard. I thought I was protecting him. Daniel's voice softened. I know you did. Another pause. But protecting someone from pain is not the same as protecting them from the truth. After ending the call, Claire remained seated beside the open box. Her gaze drifted across the letters until one envelope caught her attention. Unlike the others, it was sealed with a blue sticker. The date written on the front was exactly 1 year old. She remembered writing it. It had been after one particularly difficult appointment at the hospital. A day when uncertainty felt larger than hope. Slowly, she opened the envelope. Inside was a single page. Ethan, if there ever comes a day when you think I stopped loving you, please know the opposite is true. Every mile I put between us was never because I wanted to leave. It was because I was terrified of what might happen if I stayed exactly where we were. Claire's hands tightened around the paper. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks. For years she had convinced herself distance would make things easier. That if Ethan slowly detached from her, he would suffer less if the future became worse than either of them expected. She had transformed herself into someone colder, quieter, harder to reach. Not because love disappeared, because love remained. And that made every fear feel unbearable. Downstairs, the divorce papers still waited on the dining table. Upstairs, the truth sat scattered around her like pieces of shattered glass. For the first time, Claire began to see the terrible irony of everything. Ethan had spent years believing she was pulling away because she no longer loved him. The reality was that every step she took away from him had been motivated by how deeply she still did. And somewhere across Seattle, Ethan was living with a heartbreak built entirely upon a story that had never been true. 3 days passed without a single conversation between Ethan and Claire. The silence stretched across the city like an invisible wall neither of them seemed able to cross. Ethan had moved into a furnished apartment overlooking Elliott Bay, a place chosen not because he liked it, but because it was available immediately. The apartment felt temporary in every possible way. The furniture lacked personality. The walls were bare. The kitchen cabinets held little more than coffee mugs and takeout containers. Yet somehow it felt easier than returning to the house filled with memories. On the 4th morning, Ethan left work early after a meeting was unexpectedly canceled. Rain clouds drifted low across the skyline as he stopped at a small coffee shop near the hospital district. He ordered a black coffee and took a seat near the window. He had no intention of thinking about Claire. Yet almost every quiet moment eventually led back to her. The sound of the door opening pulled him from his thoughts. Someone entered carrying an umbrella. Ethan glanced up casually, then froze. Daniel Brooks. Ethan recognized him instantly. The man from the hospital hallway. The man he had watched through the glass. Daniel stepped toward the counter without noticing him. For a brief moment, Ethan considered leaving. Instead, he remained seated, his coffee suddenly forgotten. Several minutes later, Daniel turned with his order and finally saw him. Surprise crossed his face, then concern. Neither man spoke immediately. Daniel walked over slowly. Ethan. Hearing his name from the stranger felt strangely unsettling. Ethan nodded once. You know who I am. Daniel looked out the window before answering. I do. The silence that followed felt heavy. Ethan expected defensiveness, excuses, maybe even guilt. Instead, Daniel simply sat down across from him. I have been hoping I would run into you, he said quietly. Ethan almost laughed at the irony. That makes one of us. Daniel accepted the comment without argument. Outside, traffic moved steadily through the rain. Inside, neither man touched their coffee. Finally, Ethan spoke. How long? Daniel frowned slightly. How long what? You know exactly what I mean. For the first time, confusion appeared in Daniel's expression. Then realization followed. And with it came something Ethan did not expect. Sadness. Genuine sadness. Daniel leaned back slowly. You think Claire and I were having an affair? Ethan said nothing. He did not need to. The answer was obvious. Daniel lowered his gaze. When he looked up again, his voice had changed. Softer now. More careful. Ethan, I need you to listen very closely. Something about the tone immediately unsettled him. Daniel reached into his briefcase and removed a thin folder. Not legal documents. Medical records. Appointment schedules. Treatment summaries. Ethan stared at them without understanding. Daniel placed the folder on the table between them. I met Claire 3 years ago. Ethan's jaw tightened. Daniel continued. Not because she was looking for another relationship. Not because she stopped loving you. He paused. I met her because I was assigned to her case. Ethan looked down at the papers. His pulse quickened. A strange feeling settled in his chest. Daniel's next words landed with quiet force. I am not the man Claire chose over you. He glanced toward the folder. I am the doctor who spent 3 years begging her to tell you the truth. The sounds of the coffee shop seemed to disappear. Conversations faded. Dishes clinked somewhere in the distance. Ethan stared at the folder resting inches from his hand. Suddenly, every certainty he had built over the past week began to crack. And for the first time since walking away from the hospital, a terrifying possibility entered his mind. What if he had misunderstood everything? The folder remained untouched on the coffee shop table for nearly a minute. Ethan stared at it as though opening it might permanently change the direction of his life. Deep down, he already suspected it would. Outside, rain streaked across the glass in long, silver lines. Inside, Daniel sat quietly, giving him space to decide. Finally, Ethan reached forward and opened the folder. The first page contained appointment records stretching back 3 years. The second listed specialists, treatments, and consultations. The third contained Claire's name. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. He turned another page, then another. Each document answered a question he never knew he should have been asking. The growing distance. The exhaustion. The canceled plans. The endless doctor's appointments she always explained away. Suddenly, pieces of the past began fitting together differently. Memories he thought he understood now looked completely unfamiliar. Ethan lowered the papers slowly. Why did she never tell me? His voice sounded smaller than he intended. Daniel looked down at his untouched coffee. Because she was terrified. Ethan shook his head. Terrified of what? Daniel hesitated before answering. Terrified of becoming someone you would have to worry about every day. Terrified of changing your future. Terrified of watching you carry pain she believed should belong only to her. Ethan stared at the table. The explanation felt impossible. Yet somehow it explained everything. Every awkward conversation. Every emotional wall. Every moment she seemed distant when he reached for her. Daniel leaned forward slightly. There is something else you need to know. Ethan looked up. Daniel's expression softened. The day you saw us at the hospital. Ethan immediately felt his chest tighten. That image had replayed in his mind hundreds of times. Claire standing close to another man. The moment that shattered everything. Daniel nodded as if he could see the memory unfolding. You walked away before you saw what happened next. Ethan said nothing. Daniel continued. Claire was crying. The words hit harder than expected. She had just received difficult news. News she had been dreading for months. Daniel paused. She was overwhelmed. Ethan's eyes remained fixed on him. And the kiss. Daniel exhaled slowly. Claire kissed my cheek. Ethan blinked. What? My cheek, Daniel repeated gently. Not my lips. The noise of the coffee shop disappeared completely. Daniel continued. She thanked me for helping her through one of the hardest periods of her life. It lasted less than a second. A gesture of gratitude. Nothing more. Ethan's mind returned instantly to the hospital hallway. The distance. The glass. The angle from which he had been watching. Suddenly, the memory looked different. Alarmingly different. Daniel reached into his briefcase again and removed a sealed envelope. He slid it across the table. Ethan recognized the handwriting immediately. Claire. She wrote dozens of letters over the years, Daniel said quietly. This is one of them. Ethan stared at the envelope without touching it. The sight of her handwriting stirred something painful inside him. Something he had spent days trying to bury. Why are you giving me this? Daniel's answer came without hesitation. Because the version of Claire you have been grieving never existed. Ethan looked down at the envelope. His name was written across the front in careful blue ink. The same handwriting that had once filled birthday cards, grocery lists, and notes left on kitchen counters. Suddenly he realized something that frightened him more than the divorce papers ever had. He had spent the past week mourning the loss of his marriage. But now he was beginning to understand that he had never actually lost Claire. He had lost the truth. And somewhere inside that sealed envelope, the truth was finally waiting for him. The envelope remained unopened until sunset. Ethan carried it back to his apartment and placed it on the kitchen counter, where it sat untouched for hours. He made coffee he never drank. Turned on the television he never watched. Walked from one room to another without purpose. Every time his eyes found Claire's handwriting, his chest tightened. By 8 o'clock, the city outside had disappeared beneath a curtain of rain. Finally, he sat at the small kitchen table and broke the seal. The letter inside was only 2 pages long. Yet by the time he reached the final sentence, nothing in his life looked the same. Claire had written about fear, about uncertainty, about the burden of receiving life-changing news and deciding to carry it alone. She wrote about every moment she almost told him the truth. Every time she sat beside him on the couch rehearsing the conversation in her head. Every anniversary she promised herself she would finally speak. Every morning she lost the courage. The final paragraph was different. Ethan read it 3 times. If you ever find yourself reading this, please do not remember me as the woman who grew distant. Remember me as the woman who loved you enough to make terrible decisions trying to protect you. Tears blurred the words. Ethan lowered the letter slowly. Around him, the apartment felt painfully quiet. He thought about the hospital hallway, the divorce papers, the wedding ring, the years he spent believing Claire had stopped loving him. And for the first time, he understood how completely wrong he had been. Without allowing himself time to reconsider, he grabbed his coat and left. Rain soaked the streets as he drove across Seattle. Traffic lights reflected against the wet pavement in streaks of red and gold. His hands tightened around the steering wheel with every mile. The house appeared exactly as he remembered. Warm light glowed through the front windows. For a moment he simply sat in the driveway staring at the place where so much of his life had happened. Then he stepped out and walked toward the door. Claire opened it before he could knock. She looked surprised at first, then uncertain. Neither spoke. The silence between them felt familiar, yet completely different now. Ethan noticed the faint shadows beneath her eyes. The exhaustion she had tried so hard to hide. The vulnerability he had missed for years. Finally, his gaze dropped to the stack of letters she held against her chest. The wooden box sat open on the hallway table behind her. Claire looked down at the letters and then back at him. "You know?" she asked softly. Ethan nodded. Neither moved for several seconds. Then he reached into his pocket and removed the folded divorce papers. Claire's eyes followed the motion. Without speaking, Ethan tore the pages in half. Then again. And again. Small pieces of paper drifted to the floor between them. Claire covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Ethan stepped forward. Not dramatically. Not urgently. Just enough to close the distance that had existed for far too long. "You should have told me," he said quietly. Claire nodded through her tears. "I know." Another pause. Then Ethan gently took the letters from her hands. "And I should have asked better questions." Rain continued falling outside. The world beyond the porch remained gray and uncertain. Nothing about their future was guaranteed. There would still be difficult conversations, difficult days, difficult decisions. But for the first time in years, they were standing in the same truth. Together. Ethan glanced toward the wedding ring resting on the hallway table. The same ring he had abandoned days earlier. He picked it up and placed it in Claire's palm. Not as a promise that everything would be perfect. Not as a declaration that pain had disappeared. Simply as a reminder of something both of them had nearly lost. Claire closed her fingers around the ring. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by rain, scattered letters, and the pieces of a misunderstanding finally laid to rest, they discovered that love had survived the silence after all.